Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Tat Welch, community minister at Community of Christ Church, who will lead us in our invocation. I saw Tess just a minute ago.
We already moved that?
What does that mean? Oh, okay. Speakers. Come on up, Tat.
Thank you.
And again, just want to thank you for coming here and leading us on our invitation and all the help you've given us.
Father, we have just observed Independence Day, and one of the agenda items is Amy's essay on Memorial Day. So we are so thankful that we live in a country that's democracy, and we are ever aware of the people who went before us, the people who gave their lives, the people who lay down their lives every day for us. Father, we are so grateful for the different governing bodies in our country, national, state, city. And I am very thankful for the incorporation of Milton and for the city government. And so as we come tonight, I just ask that you be present and that you be with everyone here, the elected officials, as well as the staff and the citizens, residents, the people who work in the city, and that we constantly move and continue the dream of the founding fathers of Milton and the historical people of Milton who was here in residency before incorporation. We're a new city, but we have big dreams. And Father, I am very grateful for this city and for the people that reside. And we just ask that you bless this meeting and help everyone that speaks to be aware of all the different things that we need to be aware of tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call the regular meeting of the Milton City Council for Wednesday, July 7th, 2010 to order. Will the city clerk please call the roll and make general announcements?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I will be happy to call roll for the July 7th, 2010 regular meeting. However, I would like to remind those in attendance to please silence all cell phones at this time. Additionally, those attending the meeting who would like to provide public comment, either during the public hearings or during the call for public comment, you are required to complete a public comment card prior to speaking on an item. There is no public comment for consent agenda items or items under first presentation. Those called to speak will be taken in the order that the speaker cards were received by the city clerk's staff prior to the beginning of tonight's meeting. All speakers will identify themselves by name, address, and organization if applicable. When you hear the bell, you have 30 seconds to complete your remarks. The City Council may allow public comment on either an agenda item or general public comment from a representative of such an organized group or association, provided, however, that such an individual shall file a notarized affidavit that they have the authority to speak on behalf of said organization on a form provided by the city clerk prior to the agenda item being called. Demonstration of any sort within the chamber is prohibited. So please refrain from any applause, cheering, booing, outbursts, or dialogue with any person speaking. Please show the same respect to the person speaking that you will expect to receive yourself. Anyone in violation will be asked to leave. As I call roll, please confirm your attendance. Mayor Joe Lockwood.
Here.
Councilmember Karen Thurman.
Here.
Councilmember Julie Zonner Bailey. Absent. Councilmember.
For the record, I believe Councilmember Bailey was just a few minutes late, but
It's running late.
right now she's not here.
Thank you. Councilmember Bill Lusk.
Here.
Councilmember Bert Hewitt.
Councilmember Hewitt is not here tonight either.
Absent. Councilmember Joe Longoria.
Here.
Councilmember Alan Tart.
Here.
Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the
flag of the United
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I just want to welcome everybody here tonight and ask the city clerk to please call the next item of business.
Next item is approval of meeting agenda. This is agenda item number 10, 1164.
Okay, does staff have any items to be considered?
Mayor, we've got two items tonight. One is I'd like to add an executive session to discuss land acquisition. And also in the spirit of time, I'd like to move item 3 under new business, which is agenda item 10, 1171, so right after the consent agenda. It is a appointment of a member to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
Okay. Is there anything else council will consider for the agenda? Okay. Do I have a motion to second?
Mayor, I move to approve the meeting agenda as recommended by staff.
Second. A motion by Councilmember Tarr, second by Councilmember Longoria. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous. Also, for the record, Councilmember Bailey is present now.
Thank you, Mayor.
All right, next item is public comment. Public comment is a time for citizens to share information with the mayor and city council and to provide input and opinion on any matter that is not scheduled for its own public hearing during today's meeting. There's no discussion on the items on the consent agenda or first presentation from the public and from council. Each citizen who chooses to participate in public comment must complete a comment card and submit it to the city clerk. Please remember this is not a time to engage the mayor or members of city council in conversation. When your name is called, please come forward and speak into the microphone stating your name and address for the record, and you'll have 5 minutes for remarks. City clerk, do we have any public comment?
Yes, sir, we have two. Our first public comment comes from Chloe Dallaire.
Good evening, council members, mayor, and visitors. My name is Chloe Dallaire. My address is 2596 Birchwood Drive, Atlanta, Georgia, 30305. The reason I'm here tonight is to introduce myself. I am a candidate for Fulton County Superior Court Judge. Just to let you know a little bit about myself, I am a practicing attorney, have been a trial lawyer for 13 years and went to Emory for law school. But more important than that is not necessarily the training I received, which was excellent, but it's really the types of cases I've handled the last 13 years. As a trial lawyer, I've handled the simplest to the most complex cases involving complex legal and factual issues all over the country. And it's now my desire to bring that experience and to be a public servant. And that is why I'm standing before you. For those of you in the room who don't necessarily know what a Superior Court judge does, I want you to think about the things that are most important to you. Your family, your home, your business, your property. All of these things, including, of course, your personal rights and your personal freedoms and safety. All of those things are the utmost responsibility of a judge to ensure and to protect. And as a litigator and as a personal citizen, I've seen what happens when a judge is not prepared for that type of responsibility. And the training and the schooling that I have received in the last 16 years has prepared me to do that, and that is why I am offering myself up for public service. So please, what I urge you to do November 2nd is to vote for me. But in the meantime, please go to my website. It's chloeforjudge.com. I would love your support, whether it be introduce me to your friends and family, put up a yard sign. If you have any questions or concerns, I'm happy to answer those. My phone number, my cell phone number is on the website, as is my email. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Our next public comment comes from Jen Blackburn.
Mayor, members of the council, good evening. My name is Jen Blackburn, and I'm an attorney with Troutman Sanders, and I'm here on behalf of Verizon Wireless. I'd like to request a deferral of the proposed telecommunications ordinance. We found out about the ordinance on Tuesday and have reviewed it, and it does not seem to be in compliance with the recently passed Advanced Broadband Co-location Act. That act was signed by the governor on May 24th of this year and regulates the co-location and modification of telecommunication facilities. So we'd like to take the opportunity to meet with the city and city officials and submit some comments on that ordinance and hopefully get it in line with the law. Thank you.
Thank you. Just point of order, Mr. City Attorney. Should we allow the statement to go to public comment during the item as we discuss it, or under general public comments?
My recommendation, given the language of the codes, to have that be placed next to the agenda item in which it pertains, since that is an opportunity they have. Nothing like this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, any other public comment?
No, sir.
Okay, let's move on to the consent agenda. Will you please stay on the items?
First item is approval of the June 7th, 2010 regular council meeting minutes, agenda item number 10, 1165. Next item is approval of the June 14th, 2010 work session meeting minutes, agenda item number 10, 1166. Our third item is approval of an intergovernmental agreement for the provision of animal control services between Fulton County, Georgia, and the City of Milton, Georgia. Agenda item number 10, 1167. Our fourth and final item is approval of Laurel E. Henderson's joint representation of the City of Milton and all interveners in Action Outdoor Advertising JV, LLC, et al., versus Fulton County et al., Superior Court, Fulton County, Consolidated Action 2005-CV-109777, pursuant to the terms contained in the June 17th, 2010 letter from Laurel E. Henderson and authorization of the mayor's execution of same. Agenda item number 10, 1168.
Okay, do I have a motion and a second?
Mayor, I move to approve the consent agenda as read.
I'll second it.
A motion by Councilmember Lust, second by Councilmember Thurman. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous. Okay, will the city clerk please down the next item?
Our next item, moved by motion and vote from new business, is approval of a resolution amending resolution number 10-01123, a resolution reappointing members to the City of Milton Board of Zoning Appeals Board for District 1. This is agenda item number 10, 1171.
Okay. Councilmember Thurman, would you like to introduce Mr. Hill?
Yes, I'd like to put forth Jim Hilly as my appointee to the Board of Zoning Appeals. My prior appointee has moved out of the City of Milton, so we wish her well. But Jim has been with United Lex in the sales technology industry. He and his wife family live in Waterside. He is a fellow graduate of mine of Georgia Tech, and also in nuclear engineering, which we hope he will not have to use as part of this. And also has a Master's of Science in nuclear engineering from the University of Illinois. Jim Hilly.
Okay. Next thing then, would we have a motion and a second?
Mayor, I'll put forward a motion. I put forward the motion to approve Mr. Jim Hilly under the resolution, amending resolution number 10-01-123, a resolution reappointing members to the City of Milton Board of Zoning Appeals Board for District 1, and again specifically Mr. Jim Hilly for District 1.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, I have a motion by Councilmember Bailey, second by Councilmember Lust. Any more discussion?
Do we have too many Georgia Tech grads on this board right
I'm
now?
kind of thinking that.
Okay, I was a little worried about that. We'll let this one slide.
Hey, Lynn says there's no problem with it, so.
All right. If there's no more discussion, then we've got, again, we've got a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Mr. Hill here?
Yes, he is.
He wants to step forward. I will be glad to give him his oath. You will raise your right hand and repeat after me.
I,
James R. Helly Jr.,
James R. Hilly Jr.,
do solemnly swear and affirm
do solemnly swear and affirm
that I will faithfully perform the duties of
that I will faithfully perform the duties of
the Board of Zoning Appeals Committee member
the Board of Zoning Appeals Committee member
of the city,
of the city,
and that I will support and defend the charter thereof,
and that I will support and defend the charter thereof,
as well as the Constitution
as well as the Constitution
and the laws of the state of Georgia
laws of the state of Georgia
and of the United States of America.
and the United States of America.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor.
And as always, I want to thank you and all the other volunteers for the time and effort that you give to our city. So it means a lot. So,
That shows good balance. Even though not.
And Lynn, you will be getting with him and letting him know what he has agreed to do?
Yeah.
Crash course in BZA.
Just expect a lot of late night calls, John. All right, we'll move on to reports and presentations. City Clerk, please sound the first item.
Our first item is a proclamation recognizing July is Parks and Recreation Month, presented by Mayor Joe Lockwood.
Okay, first I want to welcome members of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board and our City of Milton's Parks and Recreation Department. And I'm going to read this proclamation first, and then I'm going to ask these members to come forward. This is a proclamation, July is Parks and Recreation Month. Whereas Parks and Recreation facilities and programs are an integral part of communities throughout this country, including the City of Milton, Georgia. And whereas Parks and Recreation are vitally important to establishing and maintaining the quality of life in our communities, ensuring the health of all citizens, and contributing to the economic and environmental well-being of a community and region. And whereas Parks and Recreation programs build healthy, active communities that aid in the prevention of chronic disease, provide therapeutic recreation for those who are mentally or physically disabled, and also improve the mental and emotional health of all citizens. And whereas Parks and Recreation programs increase a community's economic prosperity by creating desirable places to live, work, play, and visit, thereby contributing to increased property values, increased tourism, attraction and retention of businesses, and crime reduction. And whereas parks and natural recreation areas improve water quality, protect groundwater, prevent flooding, improve the quality of air we breathe, providing vegetative buffers to development, produce habitats for wildlife, and provide a place for children and adults to connect with nature. And whereas Parks and Recreation activities and special events provide opportunities for citizens to come together and experience a sense of community and fellowship. And whereas the City of Milton strives to enhance and preserve the quality of life for Milton residents by providing recreational programs and services, both passive and active in nature, with respect to our city's rural heritage and its natural beauty. And whereas the City of Milton recognizes all the benefits derived from parks and recreation resources. Now therefore, we, the Mayor and the City Council, hereby proclaim July 2010 as Parks and Recreation Month in the City of Milton, and encourage all citizens to join us in celebrating and supporting our ongoing parks and recreation initiatives. Given under this hand and seal of the City of Milton on the 7th day of July 2010. So with that said, I'd like to ask for the members of the Parks and Recreation Board and our staff to step forward. All both of you.
One is still in a meeting next door.
And how about if we can get the council come in and we'll take a picture. Board of one. Photoshop it.
He's here in spirit.
Hello.
Who are you?
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, whatever you're doing.
Good to see you. These guys we should have
ask the city clerk to please call the next item.
Our next item is recognition of Memorial Day Essay Contest winner, Amy Sheehan. This is presented by Councilmember Bill Lusk.
As most of you know, we've had our Memorial Day celebration for the last 3 years. And this past winter, our city arborist, Mark Law, came up to me. He says, why not have an essay contest based on patriotism? And I thought that was a good idea. And subsequent to that, Cindy Bonacci came on board as our Parks and Rec director. And she picked up the idea and the ball and ran with it. And we sent out invitations to the 2 middle schools in Milton, Northwestern and Hopewell. And we got 100 submittals from Hopewell Middle School. And the title of the essay to be written was Remember to Remember. That was the theme of our Memorial Day ceremony this year. Last month, we presented certificates and recognized the other 3 top winners of the essay contest. Amy wasn't here. She was traveling around the world. And she has come over tonight, and tonight we'll ask her to read her essay, and we have a certificate to present to her. So I'll just come down and give you a little moral support.
And Amy, before you read, I just want to tell you how touched and honored I was to hear your essay during our Memorial Day celebration. So it's an amazing essay.
If you would, go ahead and read it. And, I don't think she has to give her name in that.
What is the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear the words Memorial Day? What does the holiday symbolize to you? Is it just a much-needed Monday off from work? Unfortunately, that is exactly what has become of Memorial Day, just another day off. Majority of Americans just take the holiday for granted and don't stop to consider why we even have a 3-day weekend to begin with. It's crucial we think back and cherish all those men and women who have fought tooth and nail for our country. After all, they deserve to know their bravery didn't go to waste. Memorial Day can mean a lot of different things, especially depending on who you are. The day itself is all about reconciliation. It gives us a means to come together and honor the men and women in our armed forces. To me, it is a day off from school. However, it's also a day of much more. Having been personally affected by a family member overseas makes that feeling of pride and appreciation much stronger. As much as we wish there will never be any more wars, that's a little bit naive to even dream of. So as long as we have humans on this earth, then so long as we have war, then so long as we must remember. Stand up and be an example to everyone around you. Take this wonderful holiday as an opportunity and honor those who have given so much to you. It's like the well-known Lee Greenwood song, God Bless the USA. I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died who gave that right to me. And I'll gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, because there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. In truth, Memorial Day will always be a day of remembrance, a day of mourning. But how can we remember, how can we mourn, if we don't understand the holiday itself? While Americans from the West Coast to our most eastern border are sleeping in on their day off, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, sisters, brothers, sons, and daughters are out there laying their lives on the line so we can have a better life. Granted, one may not be personally affected by the current war in Iraq, but nevertheless, we still have fellow citizens fighting for our freedom overseas. How can we Americans let someone sacrifice their precious life for us and not even take a moment to recognize how unbelievably brave our men and women in the armed forces are? So on the next Memorial Day that passes by, I want everyone to stop and remember. Let those blessed souls above know they died for something great, for something worth it. Nonetheless, take a moment to appreciate those who still stand and fight today. Let none of us truly forget what Memorial Day really is.
Certificate for you. And it's a certificate of recognitions. First place, the certificate is awarded to Amy Sheehan, Hopewell Middle School, 8th grade. Remember to Remember, 2010 City of Milton Memorial Day Essay Contest. Signed by the Mayor, Joe Lockwood, and myself.
Thank you so much.
But it's really heartening to know that there's such a spirit of patriotism in our young folks, and patriotism is alive and well in this state, and it's alive and well in Milton.
Also, I remember thinking, not about Amy, still really gets it. Heard her essay. So. And also, on as myself and behalf of the City Council and the rest of the city, I want to present you, Amy, with a key to the City of Milton. So, in honor of this event. Let's get a picture. Get your dad. What's up with her? A good parent behind her, right?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And just say what we're going to do will be. You.
Okay, there's no items on the first presentation, public hearings or zoning agenda, so I'm going to move on to unfinished business. Will the city clerk please sound the item?
Approval of an ordinance to replace Chapter 54, regulating the location, placement, and leasing of wireless telecommunications facilities. Agenda item number 10, 1161. This is previously discussed on June 14th, council work session. First presentation was held on June 21st, regular council meeting. Ms. Lynn Tully.
Actually, I believe our city attorney's going to take this one tonight.
Mayor, members of the council, let me try this one. I know we have this evening this item on our unfinished business agenda. I will tell you, though, I am going to make a request along with the city manager and staff to defer this item, and let me explain why. Let me explain kind of what I have in mind on this. Presently, as you know, the city has in place a moratorium with respect to cell tower applications while we fashion and work to create a better cell tower facility ordinance. That moratorium expires on July 13th. And leading up to tonight's meeting, we have received some communications from various offices that represent various cell tower providers, and all of them have, although I think they would admit somewhat late to the game, they have nonetheless provided some comments with respect to our ordinance, our proposed ordinance. And while some of these, and sometimes you can certainly discount them, in this situation, a lot of them have a common thread, particularly with respect to some new legislation that was adopted in May of this year And my recommendation to you is to allow myself, Ms. Tully, the city manager, as well as some of our consultants to look at these comments and make sure that we are not missing some things in this proposed ordinance. Obviously, no one does any good if we have a ordinance in front of you that does not cover all the bases, particularly with respect to laws that just came into existence. We want to make sure that we have captured all of this. So what I would recommend this evening, and certainly, Mr. Mayor, if we need to have any additional public comment, let's do that. But after that time, I would recommend that this matter be deferred till the August 2nd, a regular meeting, and that staff and I will bring to you at your July 12th, you have a work session. We will call for a special meeting that evening and go ahead and extend the moratorium on the 12th for 30 days or until such time as we have adopted this modified telecommunication ordinance, whichever is earliest. But for tonight, let's go ahead and defer it, and that will allow us all to digest these comments, see if we need to do any additional tweaks, and bring you obviously back for August the best ordinance that we can bring. Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Sudie, do we have any public comment on this?
No, sir.
Okay, but I think, Ken, you had recommended taking public comment during general public comment and catching it to this.
Right, at that point, yeah.
Okay. Well, if that, either I'll open up any questions that council will have, or if there are questions, I'll open up for a motion in a second on this item.
And that would be to defer to August 2nd.
Yeah, a motion to.
Can we just go ahead and extend the moratorium right now, or do we need to have a?
I would like to go ahead and have that on an advertised agenda.
Okay.
We'll do that by way of a special
That makes
meeting.
sense. All right.
So either does the council have any questions for staff or city attorney on this?
You said August 2nd.
Yes, sir.
Julie?
Thank you. My only statement before we make a motion would just be that the things that I know we have discussed prior to this evening, that those be considered for inclusion, that being obviously the residential district definition, as well as just consistency with our zoning ordinance as it relates to notification, and specifically the 500 feet, which is in there, plus the 70, up to the 75 individuals.
Okay,
And whatever else might be considered.
Another question, Karen?
Mayor, I'll make a motion if there are no further questions.
Okay.
I'll make a motion that we defer until the August 2nd council meeting, an ordinance to replace Chapter 54, regulating the location, placement, and leasing of wireless communication facilities, agenda item number 10-1161.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, I've got a motion by Councilmember Thurman, second by Councilmember Bailey for deferral on this item. Is there any discussion from council? Okay, hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous. Will City Clerk please sound the next item?
Next item is approval of an ordinance to amend Chapter 60, Article 2, Tree Preservation of the Milton City Code. This is agenda item number 10-1162. Previously discussed at March 8th council work session. First presentation was held on June 21st. Regular council meeting. Ms. Lynn Tully.
Good evening. As you all may remember, we have been discussing this tree ordinance for quite some time. We did have a work session back in March regarding the tree ordinance. In 2008, you all put together a committee to address the tree protection ordinance and to fashion any recommendations that would further ensure and preserve our rural characteristic in the city of Milton via retaining as many of our trees as we can. So as to that, the committee has received input from local Georgia forestry personnel, as well as they've also consulted with other cities and other municipalities in order to help to find a best fit for Milton. What they found was that they had to do a lot more work, and they've done so. You'll see in this ordinance, in fact, there's a listing of a chart which gives you a quick view of changes to the tree ordinance, including what was in the old ordinance and what we're proposing in the new ordinance. Specific changes that are fairly major changes include requirements for a tree removal permit. Again, this would apply not only to commercial or other land disturbance requests, but as well as to private parties for any trees larger than 8 inches to be removed. Also, the regulating of tree service companies, such that we would have some specific requirements for those companies to do work within the city limits of Milton. Some additional maintenance requirements, definitions for tree topping as illegal activities, and other items. But those are really the major items. One of the concerns that was raised by the city attorney's team was a concern about the 8-inch limitation. Currently, in the proposed ordinance, we require that any trees over 8 inches in diameter breast height be required to be permitted, meaning to get a permit, as well as it additionally limits the removal of these to no more than 6 trees per year. The attorney's team raised the question that this would potentially lead to a lot of additional work for the city arborist, which we have one for the city of Milton. He does a great job. But it potentially will cause him a whole lot of additional work, more so than maybe some of the other jurisdictions. Particularly, they pointed out that the city of Sandy Springs did add a permitting requirement for tree removal in which the trigger is 18 inches in diameter or greater, and there are other municipalities that primarily have a larger size when they're regulating on private property, single-family homeowners. So that's the concern that they've raised. City staff has raised the same concern. I will say that the tree committee, when they discussed this, felt like 8 inches was appropriate. I'll leave that to the council to discuss in addition so that you all can give us a further direction. At this point, I know that there were quite a few questions, and I prepared a document called Tree Ordinance Items for Consideration. We did receive quite a few changes requested. I separated this document into basically 3 sections. The first includes minor verbiage, things that we could change that really don't change the intent of the ordinance, but further clarify the ordinance. So staff is in agreement that these items need to be changed. We could go through each one if you would like, or you all could go through and read these and accept them by consensus. The second section includes questions. These were specific questions on the verbiage. Some require action, but most are simply, answers are simply given. In the third section are items we definitely need to continue discussion on for council, and we need to receive some direction on if there's a change that's necessary. So I will ask you how you would like to proceed. There was also, late in the day today, a request for intent statements to be added to the tree ordinance. Again, I've prepared those. They are intent statements, so they're very aspirational statements. But those can be added. It doesn't really change the meaning of the ordinance at all. So do you want me to read all these, or would you prefer we go through just those items for discussion?
Well, what I would suggest is maybe just items number 1. If you could just briefly go through them, just because.
Yes, sir.
I've seen this just to make sure.
I understand. I know this is late.
Clear on that. So maybe if you'll go with this real briefly.
Yes, sir. All right, under recommended minor verbiage changes, it talks about removing the guy wires from established trees. This is not really discussed. It's one of those issues that it's just a practice that's done when you install a tree, particularly small trees. They tend to lean. This helps keep them in place. There's no requirement for removal of those necessarily, and this just adds a requirement for removal at 1 year after installation. Under B, 1B, requiring a 50-foot buffer around the perimeter of the project and along road frontages that should be maintained during and after timber harvesting activity. That's the section that has been added. Administrative guidelines under C, section 7D, first paragraph. restating the following with the additions: and for the acquiring of a wooded property which shall remain in a naturalistic state for the benefit of the community. And then further in that paragraph, any unspent funds will be considered reserved funds for this specific purpose and will be available in subsequent years. Under Administrative Guidelines, Section 8A4, change the shoulds to shalls in regards to locating utilities outside of tree protection zones. Under Administrative Guidelines, Section 8A5, in addition to sidewalks, add the use of alternative walkways as permissible. In F, Administrative Guidelines, Section 8B1, add the following sentence to the end of the paragraph: and approved by the city arborist, period. Upon completion of the project, the tree fencing must be removed, period. Again, it's a situation where we have a maintenance issue that just stays for a while. G, Administrative Guidelines, Section 9D3. Please include a reference to the criteria for variance to be granted. Specifically, this regards stream buffer variances. City variances are going to be required to encroach on the 50-foot state waters buffer as noted in the Milton Stream Buffer Ordinance, Chapter 20, Article 5.3, Section 20-427. And those are the specific references to variance criteria for that. And then state variances will also be required if encroaching into the 25-foot buffer as per state regulations.
Okay, are these verbiage changes something that staff, as far as yourself and our arborists, are comfortable with and would recommend that we do?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is there any comments or questions from council on these verbiage changes? Okay. Bill?
And I apologize, I haven't gone through this in extreme detail, but we're talking about 8-inch diameter trees. I guess the assumption is that those are living trees, or is
Yes,
it
sir.
spelled out?
You mean for private property owners removal, that permit?
Right.
Yeah, those are for 8-inch trees, and diseased or dying trees would not count towards this 8-inch limitation. The six trees per year, 8-inch or larger. Again, any diseased or dying trees would not be applicable to that limitation, but anything that was, a viable tree, quote unquote, would be.
Okay. Who's going to perform last rites on these trees and determine whether they're living or diseased or beyond all?
The city arborist should be called in for consultation. He or may allow for outside consultation if, they're qualified arborists.
Okay. And going on to the questions, and I've glanced through the questions. Most of them you just answered, staff has answered.
Yes, sir.
The questions. Is there anything that we need to discuss in those questions?
I believe there was one question regarding undue hardship, G, in that section. The question was, how is undue hardship defined for an appeal? And in the answer, I explained the situation in that it's set out to escalate, such that if there's an appeal to the arborist decision as to whether or not there's a specimen tree, for instance, then that comes to the Director of Community Development. If there's a continued appeal, then that goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Now, this implies that the same requirements for granting a variance would be used. However, there are not specific undue hardship definitions written out for the tree ordinance. So it's at the council's.
It comes to staff and then BZA.
Right. At this point, it's at staff's discretion, but if council wishes some specific language for undue hardship in regards to an appeal of the tree ordinance or application of the tree ordinance, then we need to go back and work on that.
Julie, and I don't want to take a break in 1 second, offer this out to Amy and her dad. I know if you have to go home and study for school tomorrow, we won't be offended if you leave. So you don't feel like you have to stay here all night. We welcome you too, but I don't want you to feel obligated to go through these line items.
Thank you.
But thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Prevail.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you to staff, obviously, for their diligence, and thank you to Mark as well as the committee on this. Obviously, some of these were my questions, and on the undue hardship, and I appreciate, Lynn, you were capturing this. On the undue hardship, one of the things that Lynn had recommended, because the undue hardship has been one of those categories that in prior ordinances we've dealt with, and I think we as a body have determined that when undue hardship is not defined, it can create some difficulty for staff and ultimately for the BZA. I would request that at a minimum, we consider, and Lynn had offered up this language, that at a minimum, we state within the tree ordinance that undue hardship is not a hardship that is self-imposed. So I would suggest that at a minimum, we capture that an undue hardship is not a self-imposed hardship. And then secondarily, we could consider whether that be tonight or subsequent to the potential passage of this with possible modifications, that we give some thought to how we would better define what undue hardship means as it relates to this ordinance. We've done some similar things, and I know with the guidance of our city attorney, we've done some similar things as it relates to the sign ordinance. And really that helped not only the applicants, but it also helped our BZA as well as staff. And then legally, I think it tended to protect us, if I'm recalling our city attorney's perspective on some other ordinances. And so that was really the purpose of that particular question. So to recap, I would suggest that the body this evening at least consider the inclusion in this document tonight, specifically say that undue hardship at a minimum is not self-imposed, but that as a next step, we also go about figuring out what does that mean, and maybe that next step can just be in concert between staff and our city attorney.
I might suggest two things on that. First, if staff wants to respond and give their input on what would work, be the best route for that if we define it more, or if that puts more burden on staff in the city, or if that's a better way to go. And then also, ask the council if they want to pursue changing that or not. So I guess first I'll ask, what I know we'll offer staff, but what would your opinion be on something like that?
Well, traditionally, I would say that as far as undue hardship goes, it is typically frowned upon if it were something. It's typically not considered a hardship if it's something that is self-imposed. So I don't think that would be inconsistent with anything that we're currently doing. So if, for instance, we were to add the verbiage that the variance would not be, the variance criteria would not include anything that would be a self-imposed hardship. It's a little more difficult with trees in that, if you're developing the site to some degree, you're also imposing it. But if you can work around it, that we'll attempt to make you work around it or work with you to work around it as much as we can.
Any comments from staff? I mean, council on that, interested?
I guess
Possibly change
my question is just, if you're developing a site and you're designing a building, is it considered self-imposed if you put the building in a certain location? I just want to make sure we don't get into a catch-22 where, anytime you're developing anything, it's considered self-imposed and there's no need for it. Because clearly, and to me, for an appeal, it has to be an undue hardship that's not self-imposed. And I've never thought of somebody putting a building in a particular location as being self-imposed, but yet I guess it could be done. I mean, I just don't want to confuse us more than, we want to make sure whatever we put here clarifies it rather than confuses us more.
Bill?
Have something.
Yeah, again, I just, I want to do what's right, but I'm all for allowing our staff to use common sense sometimes, and sometimes you put too much detail in there that it can get confusing for both the applicant and, so, I would support doing the typical scenario for this, as you explained, that it's not, if there is staff will work with people if it isn't, you'll have to define if it's undue hardship or if it's something that's imposed, self-imposed hardship on that. So, Joe?
Mayor, let me offer
Yeah.
one comment
Yeah.
on that. I mean, the way I read it is, first of all, you've got an appeal right where there's an error of interpretation. Obviously, that's not germane to our discussion. The second is that you have an appeal right where there are unique natural features on the property. Now, ostensibly, that wouldn't really trigger a self-imposed hardship either. I mean, you either have a unique natural feature on your property or you don't. So really what we're talking about is what I would call the catch-all, number 3, which is kind of and in other instances where a non-self-imposed undue hardship is created for the owner of the property. And there's precedent for that in a lot of sort of your variance language. That's typically language of variance. So I think that would be consistent with how I would interpret that catch-all. I mean, I think I agree with Lynn that an undue hardship almost by definition would not be self-imposed, ergo it would not be undue. Now, to Councilmember Thurman's point though, I mean, certainly when you start talking about moving a building around a piece of property, you could always argue, I suppose, if you made the building footprint less, therefore you could save the tree or some such thing. Is it self-imposed that you want the bigger building? And I think that's where you'd have to rely on your staff and your arborists to make the call in that situation.
Okay. Joe, do you have any comments on it?
No, obviously that's one of those tough things. You got to end up defining so many terms. But I mean, at the end of the day, we've got to leave it to our staff to play the role of understanding what fits and what doesn't. So.
Alan?
Well, I'm all about giving staff the latitude to make those calls, but they also have to have a law to back their calls up. So, I guess back to what you were saying, Mr. Jordan, are there language changes that need to be added to the section to make it more clear, to give staff the teeth they need to back the ordinance up?
Well, the point I was making, Councilman Ricard, is I don't have any problem if we want to put non-self-imposed in there. I'm used to seeing that in variance language anyway. Now, this is not variance language, it's appeal language, but I think the point is the same, is when you're looking to try and get relief from perhaps an interpretation of the code that you're not comfortable with. And I think the simple requirement would be is that if it is some sort of an appellate right that you have done by your own actions caused it, I think that's consistent with the language that's in there now. So, I mean, to the extent that we wanted to add that, I don't think it would change it materially, but it might give staff a little more teeth when they're trying to enforce it.
Yeah, I think that we need to be careful in trying to do staff a favor by making the language vague, because I think history has shown us that vague language, especially in regards to consideration of variances and other things that are in our ordinance, doesn't necessarily help any of us, and in fact sets us up for challenges. So if we can add some clarification, I think we should. And of course, I don't want to, as others have pointed out, I don't want to make it so try to make it so clear that it's not clear anymore, because we've now made it where it's now it's a catch-22. But I think we need to make it clear if we can.
I just want to say one thing. I don't think, just to clarify, I don't think any of us want to make staff, do favors for staff to as far as decisions. But I do believe most of us want staff to be able to use their experience and expertise and allow them to do the job and not put too many definitions on something to where it just gets in a quagmire. So, but your point's good. But I just want to make sure that my intent is never to allow doing staff favors to. Make decisions. So.
We don't have any issue adding in that section.
Yeah.
Some type of statement that says that it can't be self-imposed.
I think with Ken's clarification on that, and if staff's okay with that, I don't necessarily have a problem with it.
We're fine with that.
Bill?
I've sat on the Georgia State Building Code Advisory Committee for the last 5 years, and as strict and specific as many codes are, they are still open to interpretation by building officials and fire marshals. And I think any attempt to nail down each and every eventuality, every case that you could ever think of out there, I think we'd have ordinances probably would fill this room. We hire talented, educated people to fill positions as building officials and fire marshals, and they need to have that element of that latitude of interpretation to do what's reasonable. And I'd hesitate to make this any more restrictive than what it is.
Okay. I guess what we need to do is kind of go through the rest of this, wouldn't we? And if there's any other changes the council wants to consider, or
Well, let me just kind of break in at this point and tell you what I've done so far. I'm trying to capture what I think there's consensus on, so I'm keeping a running list. And I think, just so I get us current, I think I have heard that there was consensus to adopt the staff recommended verbiage changes that were in item 1. I didn't hear any opposition to any of those, either singly or collectively as the entire group. So I've written that down as a note. I started to write down to add some language in section 16C that has some statement that the undue hardship must not be self-imposed. But I don't know that I've heard unanimous consensus on that. So it's on my list, but it's fuzzy. So I need to know if there's consensus on that one.
If I could, Mayor, just to weigh in, because I don't think I got an opportunity, I would support the language. I'm sorry, just subsequent to that, though, I think we heard from Ken and from Lynn suggested language, so I was just going to say that I would support the language that staff and Ken recommended, which was simply the insert of, and not to be a self-imposed hardship. That was my comment on that.
Do you have, I guess what I need to know is if I'm keeping a list.
Yeah, almost need a census.
We almost need a sense as to whether or not.
Is there a majority that would support adding that language?
My concern is, once again, is that anytime you design a building, is it considered self-imposed? That's my only,
And I think it seems like that would be up to staff.
Right, so I'm just asking, Karen, would you like to support adding that language or leaving it out? Can I do this? Can I do that, Ken? Go down it?
I haven't really gotten an answer to whether or not that would limit it, so.
Yeah, I'd like that answer too.
Because I sure don't want people saying, well,
No,
design the building this way and it's self-imposed.
Real quick, just to maybe clarify that. If we leave the language out, it's up to the staff to make the determination whether or not a variance is required because of some kind of hardship. If we put that language in, all we're doing is now asking them to figure out if something is self-imposed. It seems like the broader definition covers both issues. So the staff can figure out, well, hold it, if this is a self-imposed issue, we can't let that slide through. But putting the language in, all of a sudden, I think makes it more complicated.
Well, but if you don't have that language in there, then it would allow a property owner to say who has, in effect, created the problem that necessitates the appeal, and staff would really not be in a position to deny them the appeal because they could say, listen, it's an undue hardship. Well, yeah, but you caused it. Well, yeah, but it's still an undue hardship. Where do
Okay, but hold it. I thought we were giving the staff the capability to determine what hardships qualify and what hardships don't. If the existence of a hardship all by itself is qualification for a variance, then we're going to have to get very, very specific on what kind of hardships qualify.
Well, and again, let me just understand. What I heard the council member say was this was not intended to be the last word on this. I heard this was at a minimum, this was a little bit of refinement they would like to bring to bear. My only point was, I think that adding that language is consistent with the touchstone of the sentence, which is undue hardship. Anyway, I didn't see a problem with it. I mean, it's
And I don't think it's intended to be things like placement of building. I think that it allows staff to then interpret self-imposed, but it specifically says effectively, if staff believes something to be self-imposed, this would say undue hardship does not include a self-imposed hardship. And it's consistent with what we've done at the BZA and other
But I
ordinances.
left a question unanswered, and that is I have not been able to answer it, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer it, because the question is, for instance, building location. a self-imposed hardship, and I think the answer is going to be, in some situations, staff may determine that it is. And I wish there was some black and white answer I could give you to say that will never be the case, but the reality is it could be the case. It could very well be that staff says, look, you don't need to put it right here. By your design, by your configuration, by your use of topography, you are forcing these trees to be removed, and we don't know that you need to do that. Therefore, your hardship, your undue hardship is self-imposed.
But doesn't, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, in that case, though, I believe, that it doesn't, staff doesn't have to say, oh, the building placement is a self-imposed. It just gives them the ability to say, we believe we haven't seen alternatives that meet that. I mean, staff would still have the authority, but in the case that they do believe it's self-imposed, they then have that language that says, we as staff believe it's self-imposed, and therefore, we request that you say that tree where they put it forward as a zoning
Well,
condition.
let me just clarify. What it would be was, we believe the hardship is self-imposed, and therefore we are going to administratively deny you an appeal. That's how that would work.
Because, I mean, this just is whether or not they can go before the Board of Zoning Appeals to even have their case heard. So that, and once they go before the Board of Zoning Appeals, their wording states that they do not grant variances unless for something that is self-imposed. So I'm not sure why we have to have self-imposed here if the BZA already says variances aren't granted for self-imposed there. This just tells the staff they don't even get to go to an appeal.
Well, they would still get to go to an appeal.
No, it doesn't, no. The staff makes the decision whether or not they can go to the appeal. If
I'll just say this, it's become much more, the intent was simply to make consistent that undue hardship is really across the board not meant to be self-imposed. We consistently, as a board in the city, have indicated that undue hardship shouldn't be self-imposed. That language was absent here, and so in the spirit of trying to be consistent, I think that we've heard from staff and our attorney that that would be consistent, would be clear. Maybe the best thing to do on this item is just to move forward and move on to the next items, and then we, at the time that we make a motion.
No, I think we need to decide each one of these as we go along.
Okay.
So we,
You know what, I'll
Whatever the
make
mayor
that decision.
decides.
I had started that. Let's just go through, and if Chris has got a good idea, if there seems to be support. Right now, I would support to leave the language as it is, and leave it up staff, and Councilmember Bailey brought up a good point, and Councilmember Thurman, if it's gonna go, past that to BZA, and, they have the right to look at it if it's hardship is their whatever you call it, imposed hardship. So, Karen and
I would prefer leaving it the way it is and letting the BZA decide.
Julie.
Question for staff.
Yes, ma'am.
Without the definition of not self-imposed, let's say it comes to you, without that language, can you deny it because you believe it's self-imposed?
Yes, ma'am, I believe I can deny it, and then they would be able to appeal to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
I would prefer to.
Leave it alone.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, go ahead and.
No,
I wasn't cutting out, Julie.
That's fine. I personally believe it's consistent, so I would prefer to see that it just simply say in not self-imposed as the city attorney suggested.
Okay. Let's move on, Lynn. Out of these questions and answers, are there
All right.
any other that might need some clarification or possible change?
I think the others are fairly explanatory.
If I may, and Lynn, I think that the one other that we had talked about was, and I've talked about with council as well, was the $5,000, the bond regarding timber harvesting. That ultimately ended up as under the questions on verbiage.
Oh, okay. Under F, yes, the question was, why is there an exemption for bonding of clear cutting specifically for timber harvesting? Currently, the state law limits the bond amount that anyone can charge to a maximum of $5,000. The performance bond is to address tree density replacement if needed and/or any necessary or corrective repairs to the road or right-of-way. We can, by state law, ask for this bond at any time, but but we haven't stated that it would be required as part of our notification process. So I think that Councilmember Bailey's question is, why do we not include it as a requirement?
And the reason for the question in particular was that in other places within the ordinance, we talk about the requirement for bonding, and this was just identified as an exemption. And so through our dialogue, because I learned that there was indeed that authority, it would seem that we'd want to be consistent and also require a bonding. And some of the things that our community development director had brought forth is that, at least in her experience, there have been cases where that sort of bonding has been helpful just to mitigate impact to adjacent properties if it happened to be nearby streams. So, some of the things that we experienced down in Kensington Farms, if that had been a timber harvesting permit, had there been a bond, that sort of a thing could help. So that was the reason, just for consistency and because that authority exists, it just was not stated here.
And again, with timber harvesting permits, they're different in that the state kind of supersedes us in what we can require for those. So we can require that they notify us, but basically it's a notification. It's not a permit. With that notification, we can ask them to provide copies of certain things, including, for instance, their submittal to the tax office, showing that they're going to pay their taxes or have paid the taxes on those trees, and a copy of the bond. But again, like I said, I don't know that we should should we go into requiring that bond? I'm not real comfortable with that, simply because the state allows us to get notification only.
But to clarify that, are you saying we're not able to require the bond, or?
Well, again, as part of the notification, we can require that they give us certain things, but we really don't have a lot of teeth in it.
I'm sorry, and I misunderstood that. I thought that your conversation, and I apologize if I misunderstood, I thought that your response was that we do have the authority to require a bonded amount for a timber harvesting permit.
We can require a copy of that bond, yes.
I mean, a copy. Can we require the bond? So in other words, by requiring
you're
a
saying
copy.
The state would require, we can request a copy of it.
We can request a copy of it. Mm-hmm.
Ken, would you agree with that? Are you having
I have not looked at that, Mr. Mayor. I can ask some of the staff.
Mark, do you?
I think the bonding is typically provided for erosion control as well as for repair or replacement of roadways. So, for instance, if the logging truck's coming in and out, tear up your shoulder, you can fix that. So the bonding would be to us, but again, like I say, that one's a little iffy for me because the state law supersedes us. So.
Mark,
Your question was, Julie, I'm sorry.
Well, I guess my question, and I appreciate that clarification because I did misunderstand that. I thought that we did have the authority to actually require the bond. I guess my question then would be, by requiring that the applicant provide such a copy, should it be required by the state, is there anything that we could do to encourage the state to require that bond? I mean, I realize that they've got that ultimate authority, but here to say that it's an exemption implies that we're not interested at all in the state implying or applying that bond. So would there be another way to at least encourage that sort of a bond in a timber harvesting scenario?
Well, I think if we at least require a copy of it, then they'll know that they need to go get it.
So I guess my modified request would be that we at least consider asking for notification of the state bond. I think to your point, if we don't at least, otherwise right now, it just says it's an exemption. And that assumes that we don't have any interest in a bond. And I think for protection, and getting consistent with other things, that we would want to at least have a copy.
Let me ask Mark, too. Mark, do you remember what the other jurisdictions are doing in regards to bonds?
Again, the $5,000 is the limit. There have been jurisdictions that have asked for $50,000 bonds and $75,000 if they hadn't had an infraction, but they're not enforceable. And the bonding does not address, it doesn't go into a lot of detail as far as what the bond is for, than being a performance bond. One county in South Georgia requires a bond, and it just states for road repairs if there's any damage to it. We can require the $5,000 bond. That's the maximum of what we can require. One problem we have with the state is when I try to inquire with them, what can we enforce? You know, like the state has these requirements that they have to provide for a timber harvest notification. And I asked the state, are y'all checking this? And they said no. I said, can we check it and deny it? They said, no, it's not our job. That's their job. So really our hands are tied. We're limited on what we can enforce
But we
'Cause
can, I think
we-
I've heard
we-
two different, we can require the bond.
We can require the $5,000 bond,
Okay,
yes.
sorry, I mean,
We can now, that's on timber.
That's on timber harvest permit.
And that's what I thought originally. All I was suggesting
All right,
is that we
sorry.
require the bond that I thought we had the authority to require. Even if it's a little nebulous, it's better than nothing.
Right.
And so that was my suggestion.
No.
I've had to provide, and I know Joe's had to provide bonds on his work, and bonds are pretty specific. And we throw around the terms providing a bond, but what is the bond really going to cover? $5,000 bond's not going to cover much if you're torn up a couple hundred feet of storm drain or something like that. Where are we headed with this discussion, I guess, with the bond? What are we talking about?
I was simply suggesting that we require a $5,000 bond that we have the authority as a municipality to impose for specific purposes to ensure.
That's pretty broad.
Well, hold it.
No,
Is
no,
the
I'm
problem,
sorry.
is the problem that there's language in there that says
It says that
it's exempt?
Yes.
Well, why don't we just take that out?
That'd be a fine solution. But right now, to exempt it seems a little silly. And I'll just say, there's been some experiences where there has been timber harvesting, and there has been damage to roadways, or there has been damage to a buffer near a state waterway. And I think it's incumbent on us, when we have an authority as a municipality to impose a bond, even though it may only be $5,000, one, it reduces our financial liability, because if it happens to be on a public right-of-way or a roadway, we then get to bear the cost at the cost of our taxpayers. I don't know why we would do that. It seems to me pretty simple. Right now, it says an exemption. I'd be happy with considering removing the exemption, allowing that to be considered by our arborist, and/or to simply add language that states the authority vested by the state of Georgia and then in this municipality, so that we go after those dollars should we need them.
Okay, I
That's pretty
certainly could support, I can see a need where, some kind of, and Bill's correct, impose a $5,000 bond probably doesn't mean a whole lot, but, there are situations we've seen where maybe it affects neighboring properties or some of our infrastructure. But I'm still not clear, do we have the right, we've got a suggestion of just excluding the term, or, do we have the right, I'm kind of mixed up a little, do we have the, I think, Mark, you feel pretty certain that the city has the right to impose on timbering, or as Lynn was saying, does that go to the state and we just, we kind of follow their lead on that?
The examples I read in the survey of Georgia tree ordinances that bonds have been required from jurisdictions. Again, the $5,000 limit.
And I'll defer to Mark's expertise on
On tree harvesting operations.
Correct.
tree
Yes.
harvesting.
Yeah, we're just talking about tree harvesting.
What is the purpose? Are they specific?
Well, and that's the question, that if
There
the
has to be-
bonds
there
are
has to be a
specific.
trigger to call the bond. If
Right.
it's a
Yeah.
bond,
Yeah, it's like, what do you do?
For instance, like a
Shut
destruction
two
of
trees.
city infrastructure.
Right, and so I would make a suggestion, and I think Mark's about to pull it up, is that we would add language to this that references a state or another ordinance that's specific, that speaks to infrastructure, that could include roadways and/or storm drains, and/or the other listing that I think Mark's currently trying to pull up. So that to Councilmember Lusk's point, it's specific, and it also gives that authority as vested to us by the state.
So be adding an imposition of a $5,000 bond is provided in state law, and then we need to reference the section, and I would assume, well,
And it's
we don't
specific to
need
timber
assume, but
harvesting.
hopefully the state law will state in there what that bond is to be used for.
So maybe as we go through these others, Mark, if you could just identify
can do
what the
that.
couple
Yeah, why don't
of
we
items.
move on, and then you can clarify that, Mark, and leave that one as a maybe there for us. Okay, Lynn, on section 3,
All right.
is there anything in here that's not just a clear-cut answer? All of it.
Yeah, these items are items for us to discuss. They look lengthy. They are a little, but some of them hopefully we can have quick answers to. Let's start with A. The question was, is DBH a consideration in determining a stand of specimen trees? Now, currently, staff does include that as a factor, but it's not the single factor in determining a stand of specimen trees. The ordinance does define what the stand should include, and that's in Section 3 definitions. If anyone wants to flip to that one. And if you'll give me a moment, I'll get to it.
And Lynn, I
Mhm.
think we can combine this with one that's later noted, whereby if there was a parcel that was effectively devoid of any trees, that we would add a bullet point to there's already a current listing that says the different things that staff and our arborists can consider in requiring trees. And I think that's really where this question was developed. So I think it's a couple of these that we could collapse into one. And that being, and I had discussed this with you guys individually, simply to add a bullet point in the specific section that says staff can consider a tree stand without any one tree having to meet, say, that 8-inch, if it's effectively the only stand of trees on the entire site. Because right now, there's a laundry list of things that staff can consider, and the one thing that is not a consideration under the ordinance is if you have a site that effectively has no trees, with the exception of one tree stand, or stand of trees. So my suggestion was simply to add that bullet point as one of many things that staff can consider, and that the tree stand wouldn't have to be black oak, or it wouldn't have to be a unique stand, or it wouldn't have to be a stand of just, 24-inch trees, but at the city arborist's discretion and that of our staff, they could consider a tree stand significant if it was the only one. And that was really, I think, where that question was intended.
And it's nothing definitive, it's just something else for them to consider.
That's correct.
That's fine. Consider it.
Okay. All right.
So are we,
What I've written down here,
Yeah,
Mr. Mayor, is
Got
just to
that?
be specific. If everybody would flip with me to section 329, which is the definitions 29E. So stand of specimen trees, and it currently reads a contiguous group of trees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it gives A, B, C, and D as options of what that is. And what I'm hearing at this point is we would add an E with language, something similar to it being the only stand on a parcel would be one of the options we could look at.
what was that again?
And Lynn, is that the only place, or would we also capture that later? Is there another-
No, I think that's the only place.
Just to add, you got it, Alan, just to add an E that basically explains that if it's the only stand on a parcel, can be considered.
Can be considered.
Yes, not that they have to, it's just that it's one of the considerations.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay. Good.
Karen said she was good with it, so I think we've got a consensus on that, Chris.
Okay, section 329E, we're going to add an E. Got it.
Okay.
Okay?
The next item is whether we should set a specific requirement for trees that must be saved on all sites to be developed, i.e., should this be determined prior to zoning and set aside specifically? Now, we have incentives for saving specimen trees. We do a report that includes what specimen trees are on the property in the rezoning report, as well as the specimen trees are all identified on plans prior to getting an LDP. The city arborist does walk each of the sites. He checks those to be sure that the trees that they said are there really are there, and if there are others, that they're also identified. So that we identify those trees, but what we haven't said, and what is, as I interpreted what was requested, was do we or should we have a defined set of parameters where we cannot, should not, will not remove the tree? Or, conversely, should we include that as a zoning condition in some zonings if we find that there's some trees there that are specifically valuable to the city? I think that's a council discussion.
Fine.
And if I might, I'll just offer, Mayor, if it'd be
Go ahead, Julia.
in one of my discussions with Councilmember Thurman, one of the things we talked about was that, and please, if I misstate, let me know, is that if we at a minimum could have some language that would state, as you just did, Lynn, that staff would have the authority and hopefully the encouragement to identify specific zoning conditions as part of the analysis. Because right now, it doesn't really state that, and it may be implied. Obviously, Mark goes out and identifies them, but there's not necessarily a process in place where today staff then identifies zoning conditions. We as a council can, of course, do that with the zoning. But if we're not going to go as far as requiring a tree save before zoning, which is that one consideration, the other, to your point about zoning condition, if we could, at your pleasure, maybe come up with some language, but if we could suggest that this document makes specific reference to those sorts of zoning conditions that are zoning specific, case by case, I think that would help. The other, and this was actually a suggestion that came up as recently as the conversation we had today, and this really has to do with zoning with recompense, so I'm going to hold that thought for a moment. But in terms of zoning condition, if we could at least state that, I think that gets us closer than simply leaving it to chance.
I think the issue is, in your professional opinion, you're Mr. Arborist, a specific tree can be saved and should be saved as a specimen tree. For y'all to go ahead and put that as one of the recommended conditions when it comes before us, rather than us having to add that as a condition.
I feel comfortable doing it.
Okay. And so what language would we, I'm so sorry, Mayor.
No, I was going to say, I think I'm seeing some support for that, which I agree with too, so.
Is that something we need to name within this ordinance, or can we count that as a policy direction?
I guess I was suggesting that.
Ask our city attorney.
I would recommend that it be identified in the ordinance.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, where would be the
Would you like to
appropriate place?
recommend wording for it to be and a home for it
It'll
to
make you
go?
earn your keep tonight.
Where are we doing that?
Well,
I don't know yet. Hold on.
We can agree in principle, and then you can work on it.
yeah, why don't we, as long as we agree with the guidance, we can fit it in.
Yeah, put that on your list, Chris.
Okay, let's summarize the guidance real quick.
Okay.
Hang on, Mr. Mayor.
The guidance is that as part of the recommendation by staff, that there will be a proposed condition with respect to the trees that must be saved, and that will be actually a proposed condition to the council as part of the zoning.
Understood.
Whether that be, and it would go back to the definition of those laundry lists of different things, whether it's a specimen tree or tree stumps, whatever your recommendations are.
Okay, good.
Okay. Lynn?
All right, the next question is who identifies and when do they identify a specimen tree? Now, again, the city arborist does do reviews upon request, upon an application, whether it be an LDP or whether it be a rezoning request, et cetera. He does go out and actually walks the site and does that review. However, there is not a citywide specimen tree inventory. If that is something that we're looking for, particularly to identify those trees on private property where we don't have any other applications, that has budget implications as well as manpower implications. And I need to know if that's something that the council is willing to do at this point.
At this point, I would think, we certainly want to, if anybody brings something forward in land disturbance or permit or zoning, we certainly want to identify as our arborist is doing, but I doubt that we've got the budget or the means right now to go out and do a citywide survey. Maybe it's something we can discuss at a later point.
Well, to that point, suppose I went out and bought 10 acres out here, and not knowing, and I was going to develop it, and not knowing what the actual specimen trees were. If I bought the property and then I came in to develop it, came in front of you and said, no, you can't put your buildings here, 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 and here, because those are specimen trees. Well, had I known that before I bought the property, I probably wouldn't have bought it or developed it like that. So maybe my line of reasoning is here, if we don't make people aware of it before they buy property, then we impose this on them afterwards, does that constitute a taking?
A regulatory taking, imposing them after the fact. You know, the precedent of that and it's been looked at before in the context of buffers and setbacks. You know, obviously you buy a piece of property, then a jurisdiction imposes buffers and setbacks. That's obviously telling you can't do certain things on your own property. I will just tell you that every time that's been looked at by a court, it has been found not to be a taking. So I think in the context of your police power, you probably have pretty good arguments on that, Councilman Lust. It would not be a taking. Great point. I get it. And certainly it might impact in a very meaningful way the financial viability of the lot, and we want to consider that. But I think from a standpoint of the taking analysis, we probably have a better argument.
And I would agree. I mean, that scenario comes up a lot, and I'm sure staff sees that, and, you know, people ready to do something with the lot they bought and going to build their house on or whatever, and that does come up a lot. But I guess, you know, you've got options if, you know, you guys work with them if they can move something, or they've got options if they need to remove a tree as far as recompense and all that. So it's not something that's going to make somebody, you know, they're not going to be happy. But I'm assuming that if that scenario happens, staff would have the ability to work with that individual property owner to, you know, unless it was just covered with specimen trees, which I don't know that we've got any areas that are like that. But
Well, and let me just add that going back to Councilman Burlott's point, a lot of times, whether you see it in any land use development regulation, that's the reason you have appeals and variances. Is, you know, if you talk about undue hardship, or if you remove the economic viability of a piece of property, and there's no stopgap to allow people to say, look, I can't do anything, that's when you start talking about, well, we need to have a variance or an appeal right.
And I think pretty typical. Most people nowadays that buy a piece of property do their due diligence, and if they're planning on developing them, you know, one thing, if they bought it and waited 10 years, but if they're planning on developing it, they'll usually run it through staff and before they close on it, and they could identify that that's an issue for them. Julie.
Thank you, sir. One of the things I'm just going to mention is that at least my intent with this was not so much to require a city-funded sort of program, but I think we've got a couple of things out there that might help us, and this also speaks to Councilmember Lusk's point about just helping to educate people on a continual basis, is that one, we're going to have a historic preservation commission, and I think that at least some of us believe that part of the historic elements within our community could include some of those heritage trees. And so it may be that through the folks that are passionate, that are part of an existing committee and or a commission that will be in place soon, is that may be a great place that dovetails with this, is that if we encourage our commission in concert with staff and our arborist to look for those sorts of heritage trees. And it may be that in concert with our Parks and Recreation Committee, you know, that could be a fun, positive sort of thing. It could be a positive education opportunity. So I think heritage tree preservation through the Preservation Committee. I think also we could enact some contests whereby we engage not only our youth but also landowners as well as developers and encourage them to proactively identify their trees. We could have a, you know, identify your specimen tree day, or, you know, have markers. And so I think that there are some creative ways that you can encourage folks to see this as a positive, and of course it could be not a requirement, but something that they offer to do. And we also then, of course, as part of our tree, being now a tree city, that could be an extension of that education. And then I think also as part of our annual Arbor Day celebrations, you know, a lot of times you could say, who's got the biggest hickory specimen tree or the oak tree this year? And I think we might find that we'd have folks that would embrace that as a positive, and maybe that's a way to also address the education piece. So that was really the intent of that.
Well, that's why one reason why we had included the heritage tree in the definition of trees, because we do have a plan where we start incorporating that as a citywide, like a tree trail or something like that, incorporating some of these heritage trees.
It'd be great for our trails to identify specimen trees
Right.
as people find good stuff.
All right, we've gone on and on this, and I'm now confused on. Back to the original question. Have we got?
I think I'm hearing no citywide tree project, tree identification project. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, and I do want to, you know, we've still got several more of these to go through, and if we're gonna have a long discussion on each one, I'm just gonna recommend that we defer this, but, so I'd like to ask, keep the questions and comments to a specific on these. Go ahead, Lynn.
All right. Under D, density calculations, the question was, is this typical for calculation of required trees, the way, particularly our chart and the things that we give credit for? I've included in here, in fact, Mark has included in here, a comparison for some of the neighboring cities and some of the other areas, including what our credits are allowed, or excuse me, what our credits require, and then how much allowance you get for existing trees and how much you get for replacement trees. It seems that we're pretty typical for tree density units per acre. We're fairly high for crediting value for existing trees. The tree committee was very adamant that they wanted to preserve as many existing trees as possible. The incentive for that is to give them more credit. So I think that follows suit. And then we're about average for replacement value for a 2-inch tree. So if you wanted to make any changes to that, please let me know.
Comments, council, or questions on that?
My only question was and I understand the rationale and I'm looking specifically at the 3.2 under the existing 12-inch to get that 3.2 versus the 0.8. I do believe that we want to incentive or provide that incentive. It was just so much greater than what some of the other communities that also have that tree preservation approach as well. I just wondered, Mark, kind of what was your professional perspective, the 3.2 versus, say, the 0.8? And I know that Alpharetta's a tree city, and they obviously work hard to preserve trees as well.
Through discussion I've talked to a couple local arborists too, and I mean, it looks like a big difference on paper, but out in the field, I mean, it's going to be pretty much consistent. I mean, we might say 3.2, they might say 0.8, but more than likely, you need to go to the site, and we're going to have more trees, more than just what we. But it was just kind of the committee felt like they wanted an incentive to.
If I'm understanding that right, basically, someone's getting more credit if they leave an existing 12-inch tree.
Correct, leave the existing.
Say, looks like it's the same as in Fulton County, but the difference in Alpharetta or whatever. So that would actually help encourage them to leave a 12-inch tree rather than plant X number of 2-inch trees.
Right. We'd rather see a 12-inch beech tree remain on site than come in and plant, several.
All right. Does anybody else question with that?
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay. The next one, under replacement and recompense trees, the question was, is a 2-inch caliper tree too small for some areas? And then in the answer, we have stated that any combination between 2-inch and potentially even 6-inch trees is allowed for replacement trees, depending on which kind of tree, which kind of replacement it is, if it's straight replacement or recompense. That mix is at the discretion of the city arborist and the developer at this time. There's no required mix. However, like I say, typically we do require 2-inch and 4-inch primarily. We rarely require a 6-inch replacement tree, simply because it's more difficult to get that tree to thrive in a typical amount of time within this 2-year bonding period and replacement period. It's hard to get that tree to thrive. So we have attempted to keep it at 2 and 4 inches.
Okay. Any questions on that?
Mayor, my question was just whether or not that would also be part of the zoning condition. And as an example, on Highway 9, I know that this council, or at least members, some of those of us who have maybe been here for certain of them, there have been instances when we have had a zoning condition that because it was a streetscape might have required a 6-inch caliper. Would it be a consideration of this body that at least we could include in the earlier captured note that Chris was capturing about zoning condition, that it could also contemplate size of tree depending on location? Again, we can always consider that, but I'm just hoping that staff's going to look at that mix and then maybe make it a part of the zoning condition.
That makes sense. I mean, I certainly understand and from experience, that some sometimes your intent is to get some instant green, so to speak, with a bigger tree, but sometimes you, in the long run, that's not good because the trees don't make it, or the chances are less. But, you know, I guess the question is, we always, you know, would there be the availability for us to specify the tree on a, certain zoning condition?
Yes, sir, I'm sure that there would, if there were a special design element, for instance, whether it be streetscape or focal point or something of that nature.
Well, can we just leave that up to them? Would that
Doesn't that fall under the design review board anyway? Don't they approve landscape?
I don't think they improve landscape typically. They, when they get a site plan, usually they get a building permit only, so.
All right, never mind.
okay?
So basically what I've heard with that one is if the staff can make a recommendation in their staff report that includes in the condition of variance something tied specifically to size of tree, if we find that it's appropriate to do so, we will.
That's fine.
I'd agree with that. I mean, and again, if the, staff agrees that that would be worth the chance, of using bigger trees, to
Right.
get more benefit out of it, then I'm sure we could agree on that. Right. Okay? Fine.
The next question is under F. Under definition of specimen trees, the question is, who determines if additional specimen credit should be given for a tree that's used as a landscape or project focal point, and when is that determination made? And again, typically that is made by the city staff arborist at the time of LDP and or rezoning report. If they're rezoning with a specific site plan that's to the point of showing us where they really have intent to preserve some trees or create a focal point. And that's where it lies at this time. If you'd like to change that, then
And the
again,
question
this is
essentially the atypical part. It was more a function of the language that had to do with the extra credit, if you would, that was being provided if they were highlighting. And that's where I think it's obviously looking for whether or not that was typical or not. I think the response was it was atypical, and my hope would just be that if you highlight those, that we don't give so much credit that we lose the benefit of recompense on site. I mean, you want to
Yes,
encourage
ma'am.
that, but hopefully they're going to encourage that anyway. So I just would hate for us to lose the benefit of additional recompense or additional tree replacement.
Right.
okay. And I think G we've already discussed, so we'll skip down to H. The recompense calculations, the question was that, the statement was that we don't state that recompense is primarily intended for replacement on site. Now, it is the intent of the document that, yes, recompense and or replacement is provided on site. However, there are some alternatives that are available should you not be able to get those trees on your site, and that's addressed in Section 7. I think we've solved that by adding, if you look on the smaller sheet, new intent statements to be added to the tree ordinance. If we just add the intent statement number 2, stating it's the intent of this section that replacement and recompense trees be located on the project site for which the application has been received. Trees which cannot be planted on the project site shall follow the alternatives outlined in Section 7.
And I'm sorry, I don't see that one.
That
I like it.
is,
See, it sounds
that
good.
was an addition after we provided
Did I get that in the packet that was passed out?
our other discussion that came up
Yeah.
Yeah,
afterwards.
No, I know we talked, I just didn't
Okay.
see the paper before me.
There you go.
My only question is, should we have a penalty clause in there that if you cannot recompense on site, you have to recompense at a greater amount, just to make it so it's not quite so, to encourage them to put it on site?
And I would support that. I think it's a great addition.
Is there precedent for that, Mark?
I'm not aware of that. The only thing I noticed reading the survey here is that a lot of jurisdictions will not allow, of course, 100% of their trees to be planted off-site. So they do require as many as they can to go on that site.
And I think the intent, too, would be that we would certainly want everything that could be recompensed on that site. The only reason the staff would allow them to recompense off-site is if they wouldn't fit on the site. I mean, it wouldn't be like it's a choice. Well, I only want to plant half the trees here, and then can I plant them somewhere else? I'm assuming you guys would look at it that way, right? And make sure that they put every possible tree they can on the site.
Yes, sir. And the replacement, the reforestation fund is not an inexpensive option.
Okay.
So,
So that kind of gives
Kind of
them
encourage them to do it
encourage
on
them
site. Okay.
All right, everybody okay with that?
Yep.
Okay.
all right, and this is the last one. The question was, how is the location for tree banking determined? Recently, the city arborist and I actually have kind of worked up what would be the priority listing for tree banking, where we would replace these trees if we can. And that does include a priority list of available sites, first and foremost being city properties, obviously, anywhere that we can clean up and fix up our own properties. We have found this a little difficult in that, we don't have that many city properties that are master planned at this point. You hate to plant a tree in the park and then decide you want to put a ball field there. So at this point, they're on the list, and as soon as we get plans put together, those will be moved up higher on the list for replacement banking. And then we've also listed some school sites. Schools have benefited in the past from tree banking. We'd like to continue that practice, and we've kind of listed those in priority order. First being Summit Hill Elementary, the next being Northwestern, and then on down. Some of these, obviously Milton High School, the Birmingham Falls High School are fairly well planted at this point, so those fall lower.
But this is just staff's discretion, right?
Yes, ma'am.
That's correct.
That's fine.
If you'd like to change this order at all, please let me know.
Okay, is everybody okay with this?
I have one suggestion.
Did we do something with that last one? We didn't add
No.
anything to those.
Julie, you have a question, then I'll see you.
Yeah, on properties, and this is just one in particular, but the Birmingham Crossroads, which actually, obviously if you go back to when that was developed, that ultimately, there were so many trees taken down, that's what effectively funded the tree bank for the trees that ultimately were then planted at Cogburn and Hopewell. I'd like to request that as an example, because right now there's still some trees that supposedly were going to be saved, but those continue to die in some cases because they really weren't cared for the way they were intended to be, is that in an instance like that, when the 2 years may have transpired, we can't necessarily go back to that original developer. I would ask that and this would also apply to maybe crabapple at certain times, is that when you have a master planned area where large specimen trees were removed, or where a specimen tree supposedly was going to be saved, but it's now starting to die, that this tree bank, at the discretion of staff, could consider also going and planting in an area that is still available for the community, some of those trees. And I don't know how you would language that. I don't know that it has to be addressed in the ordinance per se. But in particular, because some of those master planned areas have green space.
Well, you use the term at the staff's discretion, so I think what we need to do is give them the inspiration that this is one of the options they should
Yes.
explore.
That's
I
what
don't think
I-
it necessarily has to be in the ordinance.
Exactly. It just seems like the appropriate time, though, because this is schools and it's city-owned property, and nowhere does it contemplate those situations where there was a master planned area that supposedly had some tree saves. When they went to relocate it, they used a bulldozer, so it really was never intended to be relocated. But now, unfortunately, some of those that were intended for saving may have died, and I'd like to at least encourage staff and council to consider that an appropriate location should you find such an opportunity.
I do have it listed as such on the alternative replacement on other private property within the city of Milton with the approval of both property owners.
So
So-
that would fall within that.
That is correct.
Fabulous.
That is
Thank
correct.
you.
Brenda, all right, Chris, do you want to go through our list of
got it.
possible changes? We've got an ordinance here for approval or denial with some changes that we've all discussed. If Chris wants to.
I can do it one of two ways, Mayor. I can read through the list that I've collected. The second is I can read it in the form of a motion, and when I'm done, see if anybody will say that's my motion. Either or. They're both, it's kind of written the same way. Let me just start and go through it and see where we go. One of the things I think I heard the council say.
Chris?
Yes.
Can't we just vote on the ordinance the way it is and amend it with the changes that you
Okay.
guys make?
No.
I mean, otherwise, what are we voting on?
No,
Let me read what I have and see if it makes sense, okay? Okay.
That's the most ambiguous motion you can possibly make.
If
So
somebody
vote
were-
on what we have in front of us?
Let's go through
Yeah,
this.
vote on what we- but we-
Chris,
we
go ahead and
don't
go through
override
it. We've
recommended
got,
changes.
what, four?
I've got 5.
Five. Let's go
Ready?
through these.
Here we go. If somebody were to make a motion with these following modifications. One is to adopt the staff recommended verbiage changes captured as items 1A through 1G on the document titled Tree Ordinance Items for Consideration. That's one. Number 2 is to modify section 329E to include an additional criteria of a stand being the only one on a parcel or other similar wording as item E. To include wording provided by the city attorney which requires as part of the normal staff report a recommended condition of zoning with respect to tree preservation and tree caliper size. 4, to adopt the staff recommended intent statements captured as items 1 and 2 on the document titled New Intent Statements to be added to the tree ordinance. And 5, the city may require bonds in connection with the city's ability to oversee and regulate timber harvesting as provided by OCGA 12-6-24.
And that, I think, Ken, were you working on?
We worked on it
You
and
guys
found that we
worked on
can.
that
I
together.
wish I could take credit. Carter was able to find this for me, but it looks like it directly is applicable and does provide.
And is that, I guess my only question on that one, is that typical, or, you know, with cities versus the state, or, I'll ask you, Mark, is that typical to require the bond? I know we went back and forth whether we can or can't. You're under the impression we can require the bond.
I'm under the impression we can. It's, again, it's right here in the tree ordinance survey through Georgia, where communities have
The
asked.
only problem I have with that, kind of goes to Bill's point, is, you know, you could all do that, but what does it actually mean? You know, it probably, I can't see it ever having any teeth at some point, because unless you specify, this bond is, you know, you don't track mud here, you don't tear up this pipe here, you don't cut it
The
here.
language.
What I put in here was the city may require, which, you know, that gives us the authority not to waive our ability to require it under 12-6-24, but on a circumstance by circumstance basis. It at least allows us to, doesn't mean we have to.
Okay.
And does that state law not state what the
It does.
purpose of
It's
that
somewhat
bond?
vague, but it says that the bond shall be to protect the city against any damage caused by the person or farm in an amount specified. So
We
any
just have to
damage-
prove what kind of damage.
Ostensibly, it would be damage of city property, city infrastructure.
So if they damage one of our sidewalks that we had put in, they'd have to
Yeah.
That's right, and listen, I mean, I agree, the $5,000 will hardly get you through the door anymore, but
It'll be
because
nothing.
the bonding company will come back against the operator, at a minimum, it makes them be maybe a little more
A little
careful
careful.
than they otherwise would be. It's not gonna get us very far, financially.
Why don't I try to do this? How about out of these 5 changes, is there any one of them that gives anybody heartburn? That wants to discuss any more, or do we want to go ahead and open this up for a motion, and then we can discuss it after we get a motion?
If I may, Mayor, I don't want to belabor the discussion, but I would like to go back to the memo from the city attorney's office, where they did express some concern regarding the 8-inch tree limitation versus a larger caliper tree for the limited private property removal. Again, it's 6 trees per year at an 8-inch or larger tree. So there's a lot of notification to city staff, and city staff work involved in that. Is that what you all want?
what would you recommend?
Mark?
After consulting with Alfreda's, one of their assistant arborists, and again, Sandy Springs, I think the 18-inch would be appropriate. Talking with other concerned citizens, we have a lot of people that they have a rub with it being a property rights issue. You know, you're telling me I can't take my trees out. But there are a lot of people that are going to take the trees out, and they're not going to notify us, especially the smaller ones. After talking to a couple of people that I knew were really into the property rights, you know, and I should be able to do this, they really had a problem with saying they couldn't take out all these smaller trees. I said, okay, what if we said you could not take anything out larger than an 18-inch? Anything over that, then you'd have to tree for tree, or if you jeopardize the density, you'd have to replant that. Well, they felt more comfortable with that, so they said that's going to make me think twice about taking a larger tree out. If I know I have to plant something back, or other trees back, I want to save the larger ones. And the fact it's just going to be a maintenance or an enforcement nightmare, I believe, trying to enforce that strict of a regulation. Sandy Springs, Michael told me 2 years ago that he had like 500 tree permits, and that was for 18-inch caliper trees and above. And the fact that we're regulating tree removal companies now, that's going to make it easier to enforce. So I think it might seem like we're being a little more relaxed on this, but the fact that it's going to be easier to enforce, I think is going to make it do a better job of preserving our trees.
I'd
So 18
recommend
inches is what you recommend.
Mhm.
And I would agree with the concept that sometimes if the ordinance is too strict, you're going to get more people just trying to bypass it. If it's more reasonable, you'll probably enforce it more, and ultimately it'll be better for the cities for, with 18-inch trees. So I could support that. Anybody else? Julie's got a question.
Yeah, my question is thinking about different size.
Heat's on. Time to go.
The heat is on different size.
I finally warmed up.
Is different size of parcels. In other words, if you have a smaller parcel and it only has 2 trees, and both of them happen to be, I don't know, 15 inch. I'm just trying to think through this as we think about it. In that instance, it could be a large tree. Obviously, on a parcel that's 5 acres that's fully wooded, and I could absolutely see citizens saying, "Come on, guys, I've got 300 trees." Is there any way that you could have something that is moderated slightly based on the type of parcel that it is?
I'd ask staff, is that?
I mean, I don't. That's why I'm asking. I don't know.
That is one.
Oh, that's
This
tough.
is similar to the problem we have with this tree ordinance, because although that may be a good comment right there to try to incorporate that, then it's going to change. It's going to set the dominoes. I mean, it's
Just tough to get your arms
it's
around that.
right. It is, because any little thing that we change, or I won't say little, but a lot of the little things that we change, it just sets a lot. It makes us go back and change other things, and I see what you're saying. I know the size of the parcel, but then there's always going to be something else.
The next person next to them, well,
Would
I
you
wanna
be
get
comfortable with a
3 acres.
15-inch? That's kind of a compromise then?
Yes.
Because 18-inch does sound pretty big, I mean.
Especially if you want to go.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's, all right, do we have a consensus to change it to 15-inch rather than 18-inch versus an 8-inch?
I'd support that.
All right.
Okay.
Seems to be consensus there.
Good
All right.
Quick, somebody make a motion.
So now
Please.
I'm going to open up the floor for a vote.
Mayor, I'd make a motion. May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I would put forward a motion to approve an ordinance to amend Chapter 60, Article 2, Tree Preservation of the Milton City Code, Agenda Item Number 10-1162, with the additions of the now 6 items as expressed by our city manager, as well as the last, which was to also modify the 8-inch DBH to a 15-inch DBH. And that includes the intent statements and everything else that staff has provided subsequent to those conversations with our city manager.
I'll second it.
Point of parliamentary procedure. Can we actually vote on something where we don't have the real language that we're voting on? The worry I have, and the reason that I brought up, we should be voting on the document in front of us and then amend it when the language is provided, is that right now, I'm voting on something where I can't see exactly what was written. And at some point in time in the future, somebody's going to come up and say, this is not right, or that I don't understand why this ordinance was written this way. And they're going to point to all of us and they're going to say, you guys voted on this. And I'm going to say, I didn't vote on that because I didn't vote on the exact language. I'm voting on something in spirit, which I think is a good thing, but the reality is I have to have something that I can look at and review in order to say, is this something that I put my name behind? So the worry that I have, and we've done this one other time, is that when we modify ordinances like this, we can't really vote tonight on this modification because it hasn't been put together, it hasn't been reviewed by us, and we haven't seen the language that you guys are going to come up with for this. So my question is this legal for us to vote on something where we can't actually see the language that is ultimately going to be in this ordinance? Or do we have enough flexibility to do that, given that it's the spirit of what we said?
Well, First of all, let me say this. I don't think that staff gets the liberty of just getting the spirit right. I mean, we have to have some very clear marching orders. But the reality is it happens all the time, and I'll get to whether that's legal or not, but it happens all the time that governments make amendments on the fly the night they want to adopt a code. And that happens everywhere. And because we don't have the ability to, in real time, have a big screen up here and have it edited right in front of you, it further happens all the time that ordinances are enacted into law where there has been direction. This is how we want the ordinance to read. Put that in there, and that's what we're adopting. And the answer is yes, that does happen.
Okay.
All the time.
That's what happened with Obamacare.
Well, now I have to change.
Good question.
No, but it's a very fair question, and again, I get a little nervous when you say that you've given us the spirit of language. I mean, we're going to have to, as a staff, not just take the spirit of what you want. We've got to take exactly what you want and reflect that in the code.
And what Chris has read into the record, it's got to be specific and go back to the record if there was something.
I was going to say, and it's not only a good question, it's actually a question that came up in the zoning training that Karen and I went to at GMA, and the answer that was given and the examples that were given are to make your motion as specific as possible. So like when Chris said, staff's recommended minor verbiage changes 1A through 1G as provided in document titled pre-ordinance items for consideration, that's what you have to do, so that you make it very specific about what you're talking about. And if you have to reference some document that staff has provided on the fly, then that's what you have to do.
That's right.
Make it specific.
To make it reflect back so that the record shows exactly what you all just adopted, not some loosey goosey.
All right.
And just as the maker of the motion, I want to be very clear, because I believe that I am reflecting very specifically from the document provided by staff on page 1 and page 2 under tree ordinance items for consideration, item number 1 from 1A through 1G as articulated extremely specifically. And again, great questions, making sure for the record, since we've now discussed this, and as very specifically articulated by our city manager item, which was the 329E. I'm not going to repeat all that language, but also with regards to the recommended zoning conditions that were also articulated specifically earlier by our city manager, as well as the 2 intent statements as expressly noted by Lynn Tully and is handed out to each of us, as well as the may require bonds in specific reference to timber harvesting up to the amount of $5,000 is authorized by our state authorization, and then also the modified DBH as recommended by Councilmember Thurman at a 15-inch versus the 8-inch as was first submitted. And I believe that includes the 6 items, but again, I'll refer back to the specific languages put forward by Chris Lagerberg.
And I will tell you, members of the council, I mean, this is not props to Chris. He didn't know I was going to say this. He does a very good job of capturing y'all's comments in real time and reading them back to you. I have seen it
He did a
done
good job.
not
Yeah.
nearly
Yeah.
as well as that. So,
I don't know if procedurally we can make sure that, obviously that's on the record, that Julie has clarified her motion, and if she needs to make a statement of that, and Karen seconded, or...
I think the motion was made appropriately. I think it's been captured. I'm very comfortable.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion? Not hearing none. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you, Mark, for your help.
Thank you. Comment on
Sure, Bill.
this ordinance is pretty specific. It's wide-ranging. And I know the old adage is ignorance of the law is no defense. I'm just concerned about disseminating something like this to make people aware of it. You can't, I'm sure you're not going to be able to advise everybody, but there's some pretty strict requirements in here, and I could go out and violate them tonight, totally ignorant, even after having read this ordinance. How do you address something?
Well, one thing, we would start with issuing a letter to the tree service companies, because you're not going to find too many homeowners taking down a 15-inch caliber tree. That's going to be, well, you made some, but not many. So the tree service companies, once they're notified, then that we can hold them liable, and it would be up to them to inform all their employees and any of their clients, potential clients. And so that would be our first step right there, is inform them, and then just however we can get the information out to the rest of the public through brochures, some kind of mailing, newspaper,
Make sure
whatever.
you put the lush tree removal service on your list.
Yeah. But-
I have, and then he's hit on some good things. I have seen it done two ways. One would be sort of a homeowner's guide to the tree code. Now, you have to put a fairly big disclaimer in front of it that the code, because whenever you start making sort of a layman's guide to a law, the law controls, right? But that's very helpful, kind of a homeowner's guide that's got maybe some illustrations and kind of got the nuts and bolts. I mean, there's going to be a lot of this ordinance that your average homeowner won't give a rip about, but there's going to be a lot of it that they really like to have. And in one jurisdiction I'm working right now, in the context of soil and stormwater erosion, we actually have just put together a video that we're trying to run and make available on the website so people can watch a video and understand under stormwater what their obligations are. Again, with the same disclaimer that the law controls, and to the extent that artistic license was taken and didn't exactly capture it, that isn't. But those are just two ways you can kind of reach out to your community and try to put together something to help your average citizen know what is expected.
Does the video have profit?
Why don't I suggest that maybe that's something that Maura could work with Jason?
Yep.
And so you already think about Chris, we can include that on our website.
Okay.
Jonathan also said he was going to write a very specific front page article on the tree ordinance and what it contains.
All right.
And a final note, I have had more people calling this past year inquiring about tree removals than I have since we've been here. So word is getting out that there is, there are some requirements. So,
Mayor, before we move on, I just want to commend all of us for working through the recommendations that our colleagues offered and working through those and having a good, healthy discussion on those. I think this is a good consensus ordinance that we come up with, and I think we did a good job on that.
All right, great. Thank you for your input. Okay, moving on to new business. City Clerk, please down to the next item.
Next item is approval of an agreement between the City of Milton and Optech RWM LLC to provide public works field services. This is agenda item number 10, 1169. Mr. Carter Lucas.
Mayor and Council, thank you. As you know, Public Works operates under a public-private partnership where we contract out services for signs and signal maintenance, mowing, park maintenance, stormwater, various services, various field services for Public Works. Since the first of the year, Public Works has been operating under transition contracts to allow staff enough time to put together an RFP and formally bid those services out. I'd like to, say thank you to Vic Jones for his efforts in putting that RFP together and helping us in the early stages of that. We have put those services out to bid. We did receive a number of responses back from that bid. And tonight we're presenting a recommendation from staff to move forward with a contract with Optech RWN, formerly Optech Manette, one of our current service providers. They put together really an outstanding RFP for the city and represented what we thought was probably the best service delivery and financial package to provide these services on an ongoing basis for the city. So with that, we are recommending approval of the contract with Optech RWM. Annual cost for that is $530,000 with an hourly rate. In addition to that, for our signal maintenance, which is the way we handle those calls right now. With that, I take any questions, but that's it.
I want to clarify that this is basically the same scope that, and actually the same company that's been handling these projects for the city since day one. Is that correct?
Optech Manette has been providing some of those services for us, yes, sir. It's actually a slightly larger scope than what they've been providing up to this point.
I guess my point is that our citizens and council shouldn't see any difference in service, and, hopefully better, but this by passing this contract, approving this contract, we're not taking out scope or adding necessarily any scope of what the city's been providing.
No, sir.
Any questions?
To the contrary, even though it represents a larger scope, it represents over $180,000 in savings.
That was my only question, is just to please state for the record how much this saves the city. And that would be?
A little over $180,000 annually.
And I just want to make a statement of that, because I know as we've moved into this structure, so to speak, public-private, I think there have been some people that thought, well, we're going into traditional government versus public-private, but this is a good example that we really have not changed. We are still out on the competitive bid market, and the taxpayers are getting the benefit of that. So that's
Yes, sir.
the comment that I was going to make. This was competitive.
Yes, sir, it was.
Okay. Do I have a motion and a second?
Mayor, I'll make a motion to approve an agreement between the City of Milton and Architect RWM LLC to provide public works field services, agenda item 10-1160.
Second motion.
Okay, I have a motion by Councilmember Tartt, second by Councilmember Lustig. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous. Will the city clerk please call the next item?
Approval of a resolution to approve the submission of a grant application to the Department of Justice's Community-Oriented Policing Program. Agenda item number 10, 1170. Mr. Matt Marietta.
Good evening. Last year I brought you an application under the Recovery and Reinvestment Act for an application for the Community-Oriented Policing Program to the Department of Justice to hire 3 police officers. That grant, because it was associated with the Recovery Act, was largely driven by holding off furloughs and reductions in force in police departments. And thankfully, because we've been responsible with our pocketbooks, we didn't have to do that last year. The grant for 2010, when the grant period opened for the exact same grant, it was no longer funded by the Recovery Act, so that kind of changed what they were looking for. It went back to the original purpose of the community-oriented policing grant, but the only applicants they allowed were ones that had not been awarded the grant the previous year. And so this gives us the opportunity to resubmit. However, based on the way the program is written this year and the size of our police department, the size of our city, we're only eligible to ask for 1 position instead of 3. This grant continues to be 100% funded for a 3-year period, and it will provide salary and benefits for the cost of an entry-level police officer for 3 years, with the stipulation that we fully take over that salary and benefit cost in the 4th year and maintain that officer for 1 year after the 3 years. So it's a 4-year total program. 3 years completely funded, 1 year we fund, which works out to approximately $166,894 over the 3-year period, and then an additional $58,000, $59,000 based on our starting salary and benefits for that 4th year.
That's our only obligation.
Yes.
Questions from Matt?
You can come and like grants.
Okay. I have a motion and a second.
Mayor, make a motion to approve a resolution, approve a resolution to, okay. I make a motion to approve a resolution to approve the submission of a grant application to the Department of Justice's Community-Oriented Policing Program, agenda item number 10-1170.
I'll second it.
Okay, I've got a motion by Councilmember Tartt, second by Councilmember Thurman. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, moving on to reports, I want to say, I think we've had a productive retreat follow-up and training and classes in Savannah at the GMA conference, so I want to thank everybody for being down there. I think that was good. Do I have any council
let me know. Just in preparation for next week's work session, I know that we were provided, obviously, an agenda, and part of that has to do with zoning amendments. And I just wanted to ask for consideration and discussion a week from now, and I wanted to do it with everybody here, would be whether or not we could consider or discuss, and if we can't next week, maybe at some future point, to discuss, and there's specifically the potential for residential buffers, and it's something that many of us on this council have talked about in the past. And just because we're talking about text amendments, it seemed that that might be the right time to talk about it. So I just bring that up as a question. I don't have a presumed answer. But specifically, a residential buffer, as an example, if you were to put in a subdivision off of one of our open roadways, right now we don't really have a buffer requirement between road and, say, first house. And some of the things that we've talked about in preparation for trying to promote our scenic byways, et cetera, was to have a buffer that would be between the road and the first house. And so because it just seems to be in line with some of the discussion for our work session, if that's not appropriate to add that, that's fine. I just bring it up.
I'll
Given
check
the
with Ken
agenda.
tomorrow. My gut tells me no. I
That's
hate
fine.
to tell you no, but my gut
That's
tells
fine.
me that we were very specific in our agenda as to what we are going to talk
Right.
about. If we had been more vague in our posting, then maybe, but we were very specific.
This just seemed the first time to really say, okay, as we start to look then at text amendments, if it be the pleasure of this council that we at least consider that along with others in the future.
Good.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, we have a motion and vote, executive session. Do I have to discuss land acquisition? Do I have a motion, a second to adjourn into executive session to discuss land acquisition? So moved. Second. And motion by Councilmember Longoria, second by Councilmember Tart. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Tell us it's going to be 4 minutes or less. So.
Go.
Everybody run.
Hang on. conclude our meeting. Do I have a motion that we adjourn?
I move to adjourn the regular meeting of the Milton City Council.
Have a second?
Second.
Motion by Councilmember West, second by Councilmember Tart. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous.
All right. It's a good meeting, Al.